we really look forward to your talk today.
Thanks very much, Rob. First, I'd like to thank Rob and Kevin and Fergal for inviting me today, and I'd like to thank the now 119 people out there, that's great, who got up today to listen to the talk. The talk is sort of divided into three sections. One is kind of about me and why you might listen to me on this topic. That's a short section. The second section is about the ways in which I think we should start broaching the topic of the replication crisis with undergraduates. And the third part's about the languages we use to teach statistics and how we might shift those in a way that would be more useful for students. So here I go. As I was scribbling down the notes that I hoped to knit together into a coherent address for you today, I began to realize that you know what I need to do? I need to share my screen, don't I? The host has disabled participant screen sharing. Can someone allow me to screen share?
Oh, I thought as a panelist you would be able to do that. Let's see.
Oh, wait, here we go. It is back. Can people see that?
Yep, it's not, yep, there we go. Perfect.
There you go. Good. Okay. Anyway, as I was scribbling down on these notes for today's talk, I began to realize that my experience of the replication crisis has probably been different from that of most people. And as a result, I'm frequently astonished by the resistance put up against the idea that we need to reform our statistical practices, because I expected the kinds of people who have led that resistance, many of them remarkably prominent people sitting upon the very highest perches that the discipline has to offer, they should know better. The replication crisis did not come as a shock to me or even a surprise particularly, or what I should say is that what surprised me was not that there was a replication crisis, but rather that a sizable number of psychologists had finally taken the problems of statistical analysis in psychology seriously, and were going to spend a portion of their precious time trying to do something about it. Especially when it became apparent that they were going to face a wave of resistance that, unless they happened to be in a privileged position occupationally, would threaten to have adverse effects on their academic careers. So why was I not particularly surprised by the emergence of the replication crisis? Mainly because of this book, portions of which were assigned to me back in the early 1980s by my undergraduate methods teacher, a man named Stuart McKelvey, then teaching at tiny Bishop's University deep in rural Quebec. The book is a collection of reprints edited by Badia, Haber, and Runyon way back in 1970, a half century ago now. And what was in it? Well, there were classic articles by Martin Orne on demand characteristics, by Bob Rosenthal on the oddness of volunteer subjects and on the effects of experimenter expectations on subjects' behavior, by Lee Cronbach on psychology's two disciplines, and by Bill Estes on the problems of making inferences about individuals from group data. But the most important, most eye-opening for me part of the book was the block of articles on statistics and null hypothesis testing. Those were by people like Jum Nunnally, John Tukey, Bill Roseboom, David Bakken, David Licken, and Paul Meehl. I am also certain that Stuart, for professors were called by their first names at Bishop's, also taught us about Jacob Cohen's classic 1962 power paper, and he taught us about Rosenthal's file drawer problem. These 7 articles, 6 of them published prior to the Summer of Love, how many of you remember that, gave me the basic grounding for what 40 years later we have come to call the replication crisis in psychology. So you may ask, if I knew all this back then, why didn't I do something about it? Well, first, as an undergraduate at an obscure college in the boonies, I wasn't really that confident that I understood what I was reading, and indeed it would take years for me to fully understand it. Second, the authors of these articles, Tukey, Meehl, and Cohen especially, continued writing through the 1970s and 1980s, and even into the 1990s. I can remember discovering Meehl's 1978 Theoretical Risks and Tabular Asterisks when I was a master's student, and thinking it was probably the most important article I had ever read. But no one else around me seemed to be much interested, including the department's 2 quite imposing statisticians. In any case, there were few ways to navigate the discipline then, unless you did the kinds of analyses that the discipline demanded, null hypothesis significance tests. And I wondered whether these objections might themselves be a kind of tacking down the corners problem, like Thomas Kuhn wrote about with respect to normal science in the structure of scientific revolutions. The sort of problems that are technically unresolved, but ultimately of little real import. Could it really be, I asked, that the whole vast discipline of psychology, full of smart people whose work I admired, was blind to so gaping a lacuna in its basic structure? Nah, it must be me. So after starting my PhD at the University of Toronto, I soon ran into an intellectual renegade of sorts named Andy Kukla. He taught a fascinating course with the unusual title of Theoretical Psychology. This is the book that came out of that course. I quickly arranged to become his teaching assistant, and it was there that I first learned a bit about that other way of doing statistics, Bayesian analysis. Andy did not teach that NHST-friendly version of Bayes that is popular today, Bayes factors. Instead, he taught Bayesian theory as an understanding of the scientific process itself. As the scientific community accumulates data, the posterior probabilities that it collectively assigns to various theories move about. It is, in a sense, the only understanding of science that simultaneously takes seriously both the social and the quantitative aspects of science. Somewhere in there, I read Settlemyer and Gigerenzer's 1989 replication of Cohen's classic power study. And there was also Cohen's 1990 Things I Have Learned So Far. It all made me a bit queasy. I mostly avoided using null hypothesis tests in my dissertation by doing computer simulations instead. And when I got my current job at York, in a program then titled History and Theory of Psychology, that was vague enough to permit me to do pretty much whatever research I wanted. So while retooling as a historian, I kept my quant skills active by teaching introductory statistics. The mid and late 1990s saw a steady drumbeat of warnings about psychology's methodological and statistical practices. There was Cohen's The Earth is Round, P less than 0.05 in 94, Norbert Kerr's Harking article in 1998, and of course the report of the APA Task Force on Statistical Methods led by Wilkinson in 1999. But these were ignored or finessed by most of the discipline. I taught some of this material in my Intro Stats course. I used David Howell's textbook mainly because it was one of the very few that showed how to actually compute power estimates rather than just hand wave about it vaguely. In retrospect, though, I probably didn't teach enough about these problems. I didn't want to seem like one of those madman professors who has wandered far off the main path of the discipline in search of some mythical treasure that he claims lies deep in the woods. After all, perhaps I was wrong. Much of the rest of the discipline seemed to think so. Then, in 2010, like many of us here, I suspect, I got wind of Daryl Bem's precognition study, then circulating in preprint. And soon after, I saw E.J. Wagenmacher's devastating Bayesian takedown of those studies, and by extension, his calling into question the statistical practices of nearly all of psychology. L'affaire Bem and the response to JPSP's failure or refusal to acknowledge what was truly at stake dominated a lot of 2011 and 2012. And then rumors of Brian Nozick's attempt to replicate dozens of apparently firmly established effects began to circulate. As I'm sure you'll all remember, the resulting article in Science landed like a bit of a bomb in the middle of the discipline in 2015. I was just then in the process of developing a statistics course for first-year graduate students, and I couldn't not talk about Nozick's article. It seemed to be the most hotly debated statistical article in decades, and indeed it substantially changed the way I taught that course. Instead of simply teaching the usual string of ever more complicated variations on ANOVA and regression, I turned part of the course into a critical reflection on what my students had learned about statistics as undergrads, not just in their courses, but also in their supervisors' research labs, and how much of that they should continue to believe. In 2017, I had the pleasure of attending the second meeting of Nozick's Society for the Improvement of Psychology, or SIPS. in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is the middle of Charlottesville here. And there I found myself for the first time in a room with a couple hundred people who had roughly the same concerns about statistical practice that I had harbored since my undergraduate years. And there I learned from others about the other relevant articles I had missed over the previous decade. John Ioannidis's Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, and Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson's Fake Positive Psychology, and later their P-Curve article. John Lowenstein and Prelick's Survey of Psychologists' Statistical Misdeeds they would admit to anyway. Masicampo and Lalonde's Distribution of P-Hacking in the Published Literature. Heather's and Brown's Careful Forensic Work, Daniel Lacan's Critiques, Michelle Neuton's Stat Check, the gang, if you're into the replication crisis. The SIPS conference was a bit of a revelation, and it changed the trajectory of my research. I started writing papers about these problems, but I also started getting papers rejected from journals at a rate that I hadn't seen since my earliest years in the biz. Reviewers just didn't believe it. They didn't want to hear it. They thought I was being alarmist. This was a second revelation for me, a counter-revelation, if you will. But it turned out that there was a ready market for conference talks on the topic, especially in Europe. And the talks I gave on the topic drew some of the largest audiences I had ever had, though, to be fair, before that, I mostly spoke on history of psychology. So, an interesting feature of those audiences was that a large proportion of them were younger scholars, graduate students, and early career researchers. And they almost always had the same question. They didn't doubt the reality of the problems, and they didn't accuse me of being alarmist. Instead, they wanted to know how they could remain true to their statistical principles, but not run afoul of their older, dubious supervisors and tenure committee members. I didn't have really terribly helpful advice for them. I said, do what is required for you to graduate and get tenure. Stay in the discipline because we're going to need you for the coming fight. If the word fight seems too strong, these were the times when Ivy League professors were publicly calling out young statistical reformers as thugs, bullies, and even terrorists. So that is almost certainly more of my personal history than you wanted to hear, but it was intended as an explanation of why a group of people who have themselves taught statistics for many years might spend time listening to me, of all people, on the topic of whether and how we should teach the replication crisis to undergraduates. So yes, of course we should teach the replication crisis to undergraduates. Yes, they can learn it. I'm a living existence proof that they can. But you weren't a typical student. You went on to become a professor, I hear someone say. Let me say in response that I was far from a glowing exemplar of studenthood in those days. I ended up at Bishop's after having dropped out of the much more prestigious McGill University, where I had gotten a D, if I recall correctly, in my first statistics course. In any case, if your students can learn how a t-test works, then they can learn how it fails to work just as easily. But, I hear many people say, won't teaching students about the replication crisis discourage them, turn them away from statistical analysis, or even from psychology as a whole? Well, this is all a matter of where your loyalties lie. Do you take the job of a professor to be that of booster for the discipline? Or do you think there should be a code of silence among psychologists with respect to psychology's as yet unresolved difficulties? Or do you think that the first loyalty of professors should be to teach the truth as they see it? First, if the legitimate problems of psychology seem so intractable that they are literally driving students from the discipline, that is their prerogative. It's not ours to retain them by keeping them in the dark. And second, if the problems of psychology are indeed so intractable that they drive students from the discipline, then perhaps our focus should be on fixing the discipline rather than on retaining students who have seen the truth. Now, yes, of course, as an instructor, you're going to have to make judgments about whether the students before you are prepared to properly digest a given topic. One has to have command of a certain body of knowledge before one can comprehend and fairly assess complex criticisms of it. But I don't really see why undergraduate students should be unable to grasp things like the major methods of p-hacking, the problems of harking, the implications of publication bias, and even how to conduct the simpler forms of Bayesian analysis. None of these matters are any more difficult technically than what we teach them already. It's not like they need to know integral calculus for these, but not for ANOVAs. What is different about them is at best conceptual, by which I mean taking a wider view of the field, and at worst egotistical. Can it really be that the discipline to which I have committed so much time and effort is beset by such fundamental errors? Well, yes, of course it can. Just consider how alchemists must have felt when modern chemistry started to come into view. The question of how and whether to teach undergraduates about the replication crisis has not gone unaddressed before now. Indeed, back in April 2018, the journal Teaching of Psychology published a validation study of a whole course that the authors had already developed on the topic. Later that year, the same journal published a survey of whether the new statistics had started to make their way into the undergraduate curriculum. Spoiler alert, they hadn't, but for a bit on effect sizes. More recently, the APA Education Directorate published a brief online article about how the replication crisis can be used to improve the teaching of scientific literacy. And just a few days later, the journal Teaching of Psychology, again, released online an article titled, quote, "What Psychology Teachers Should Know About Open Science and the New Statistics." So the topic has already been broached by others. The way I see it, there are four major issues of what we might call scientific integrity to be considered here. The first, which definitely belongs in the undergraduate statistics course, are the fundamental problems of NHST. As you all know, p-values are widely misinterpreted. We should cover the multiple surveys of professional researchers in which a majority misunderstand what p-values mean. And we should, of course, also teach what they really mean. And as well, we should discuss whether that is information that anyone has ever wanted to know, or whether it has always stood in as a proxy for our real question: how likely is it that this hypothesis is true? We should talk about how the p-value has a tendency to amplify what is in fact quite weak evidence. And we should discuss proposals to make alpha more stringent, like Benjamin and all those people wrote about in 2017, wanting to reduce it to 0.005, or to make it more flexible, like Daniel Lakens has written about, that we should justify each of our alphas relative to the context in which we're using them. Finally, I think we should teach the remedies that have been proposed to shore up the weaknesses of NHST: effect sizes, power, confidence intervals, data visualization, and so forth. I assume that most of us here are already doing these things. Less common, perhaps, we should include a unit on equivalence testing here as well, since NHST is so often used to establish non-differences between groups such as genders. Second, we need to be more forthcoming about the common but illegitimate manipulations of NHST: optional stopping, failing to report non-significant groups and non-significant DVs, harking, all the various forms of p-hacking or questionable research practices or researcher degrees of freedom, whatever your favorite phrase is. Whenever I talk about this, I feel compelled to recount the story I once heard of a lab where the computer was programmed to alert the researchers the moment the data that had been collected thus far reached bare significance, at which point data collection was terminated, the results written up, and the study submitted to a journal. Simmons et al.'s 21 article, False Positive Psychology, should probably be discussed in detail, since it demonstrates so clearly that these are not just theoretical or merely technical issues, but they are matters that can actually change the outcomes of experiments. In addition, this is a good place to talk about the impact of the file drawer problem and of publication bias more broadly, about the distribution of p-values that are found or not found in the published literature. Some have estimated the rate of false positives in the published literature to be 30%. Some say 50%, some say higher. I heard a recent talk claiming that they were lower. Nobody really knows, but it is almost certainly higher, far higher than the 5% that nearly everyone seems to still misguidedly believe. Perhaps we should also introduce some of the forensic tools that have been developed to discover these problems: P-curves, Z-curves, stat check, Heathers and Browns, various computer programs, Grim, Grimmer, and Sprite, those kinds of things. Should we also discuss outright fraud? Is it common enough to be worthwhile? Of course, we don't know what the level of outright fraud is. We all defensively assume it to be low, but it isn't just Hauser and Stoppel anymore. There was another major case reported in Germany just last month, a top anxiety researcher named Hans Ulrich Wittgen. If you haven't heard about this one, there's a media phenomenon in which, as cases begin to pile up, each new one becomes less newsworthy than the one before. And this can lull one into thinking that it isn't happening anymore when exactly the opposite is the case. It has become so common that it has become boring. Third, I think we should talk about proposed solutions. Replication and reproduction is the process that I have the most confidence in. I have been rather surprised, however, at the number of professional researchers who profess not to know, or who even deny, that replication is the hallmark of science. If conditions are so beyond your control that you are unable to reliably replicate the phenomenon, then what you have is not so much a scientific fact as it is a singular miracle. Hidden moderators are not an explanation. They are signs of what the celebrated philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, dubbed a degenerating research program. It is an ad hoc hypothesis that brings no new empirical content to the table. Here we should teach about direct and conceptual replications and about the massive multi-site replications that have been undertaken. We should also instruct students in the benefits of pre-registration and of registered reports. Some will ask whether this really belongs in a statistics course, and my response is, if we don't teach it to them, who will? Better to teach it to them twice than risk it slipping through the cracks of their education. And this is also where we should teach about Bayesian methods. JASP has not only made this easy as pie to do now, but it also it makes it simple to compare the traditional Fisherian results to related Bayesian results, and to talk about the differences in interpretation that each require. Finally, let me talk a bit about meta-analysis. First, it may be too difficult for all but the most advanced undergraduates to grasp. Second, opinions on its vary on its value. I, for one, am fairly wary of most meta-analyses due to the tendency of most meta-analysts, Linda's article, or Linda's talk yesterday excluded, of course. I'm sorry, I've lost my place, just a second here. Due to the tendency of most meta-analysts to depend on published sources only. Sanjay Srivastava once quipped that meta-analyzing only published sources to find a true effect size is a bit like trying to estimate the average height of high school students by measuring the heights of the basketball team only. There are, of course, various ways to estimate the size of the unpublished corpus, but I remain pretty doubtful. Most studies that result in non-effects are never even written up. The phrase file drawer here misleads us into imagining that they were fully completed, written up, and literally placed in storage somewhere. But how do we estimate all the half-completed studies, all the pilot studies that went nowhere, all the unpublished master's theses, and even undergraduate honors projects? In principle, all of these should go into the computation, and I have trouble believing that we can even roughly estimate these kinds of results. Fourth, and finally, there is a case to be made for teaching about the perverse career incentives that serve to deflect researchers from upholding research integrity. Again, this isn't strictly statistical, but it should be explicitly taught somewhere. First, so that students can read research critically, and second, so that it doesn't come as a surprise to students who go on to graduate school. We need to talk about how important the sheer number of publications is to tenure and to funding. And then we should talk about the lengths to which some academics are willing to go in order to increase their number of publications, minimal publishable units, salami slicing, that sort of stuff. And we should warn students about predatory publishers and fake scientific journals. This is not a side issue anymore. Just before the pandemic, it was estimated that there were more than 1,400 predatory publishers out there, operating something like 8,000 fake academic journals, many of which have perfectly plausible titles like the International Journal of Psychology and Behavior Research. Collectively, fake journals publish around 400,000 fake articles each year. considering that there are approximately 32,000 legitimate academic journals publishing in the neighborhood of 2 million legitimate articles every year, the proportion of fakes now amounts to approximately 20% of journals and 15% of articles across all of academia. It is important that students be aware of this phenomenon, lest they unknowingly run across these journals online while doing their own research. Of course, to prevent faculty from getting credit for publishing reams of unread mini articles, administrators upped the arms race by taking up citation counts as the primary measure of faculty productivity. In particular, they seized upon and badly abused Eugene Garfield's ancient impact factor. How many people know that impact factor was first proposed in 1955? And now we have a whole new generation of such metrics: the H index, the G index, the I-10 index, and my favorite, the TWIMPAC factor, which is the number of times an article has been mentioned on Twitter, among a bunch of others. Of course, every citation does not imply positive regard. BEM's precognition study has now been cited over 1,100 times. How many of those do you imagine were to praise it? In any case, every citation metric suffers from what has been dubbed Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. That is, once people know how their work is being measured, they will seek to influence the measure directly rather than by improving the thing being measured. As a ready example, consider the number of students who have come to you pleading to raise their grades rather than asking how they could have learned the course material better. In the realm of citation metrics, we see Goodhart's law operating in stories of journal editors who insist that authors cite more of that journal's previous publications to raise its impact factor. We see it in stories of academics forming citation cartels, in which they agree to cite each other's work regardless of its relevance to their own. A couple of years back, a university dean was found to have ordered his faculty to cite the work of their departmental colleagues more frequently because government funding depended on the number of citations of the department's publications. There have been stories of academics using pseudonyms to publish fake articles in fake journals, but each one bearing multiple citations of the author's real publications, simply to boost the number of citations of those articles. Do undergraduate statistics students need to know about all this? Well, it's a judgment call. I think that it is best that they see a bit of how the sausage is really made. So before my time runs out, I want to touch on one other topic: the languages in which we teach statistics. Something I hear quite often is people attempting to wield the term scientific like some weapon of mass instruction. Such attacks usually begin with phrases like, if only we could make students or psychologists or politicians or the public more scientific. Now, I've passed through a fair number of different disciplines in my day: music, psychology, theater, artificial intelligence, philosophy, history. And as a result, I view with a pretty jaundiced eye the myths and half-truths that each discipline tells itself, and they all do it, to reassure itself that it is way better than the discipline next door. Consider, when's the last time you heard a psychologist say something nice about sociology? Now, if I were smart, I would use that knowledge to my advantage by wooing whomever I was talking to at the moment with a firm endorsement of the local home truth. But sadly, I am not that smart, and I have a natural tendency to play opposite to whomever I happen to be talking to. So here goes. Probably the most controversial thing I will say today. I think that we should teach statistics more like we teach the humanities than most of us do now. Now, don't get me wrong, science is a grand thing, but we already have lots of the scientific attitude in the statistics classroom. What we don't have a sufficient amount of is the recognition that statistics act as a tool of rhetoric in scientific discourse. And rhetoric, as you may recall, was one of the Middle Ages' 7 liberal arts, specifically an element of the trivium, along with grammar and logic. And come the Renaissance, the trivium, more or less, became the humanities. Gadzooks, I hear someone cry. He's a spy from the House of Letters. Quick, bind him to the stake. Good people, please bear with me for a moment longer and allow me to explain. We have a tendency to contrast language and math as though they were somehow alien or even opposed to each other. But I say unto ye, they are not. Math is a part of language. Consider 2 + 2 = 4 is an English sentence, subject, verb, object. Indeed, if you look into the history of what medieval Islamic scholars called al-jabr, which is what we today call algebra, you will find that it was not expressed in the compact lines of abstract symbols like we do today. Instead, it was written out in linguistic form, like we might write out a story about, say, how we spent last summer. Well, maybe not this particular past summer, but you know what I mean. So what, someone asks, who cares what people from a wildly different culture did 1,200 years ago? Well, although like you, I prefer our formal mathematical language for working algebraic problems, the medieval example stands as an existence proof that a fairly advanced form of mathematics can be practiced within the confines of natural language. And if you don't think that algebra counts as advanced enough to make the point, I urge you to require your students to do a few lines of algebra in your next exam. Second, this brings me to one of my favorite modern statistics books, Robert Abelson's 1995 Statistics as Principled Argument, especially chapter 4, titled Styles of Rhetoric. So if you don't trust me, then perhaps you'll trust a modern statistician like Abelson. In his chapter on statistical rhetoric, Abelson wrote, "To the student who asks, 'Can I do this?' a reasonable answer is, you can do anything you choose and ponder the potential meanings of the results for your research. But keep in mind the way you present the outcomes will affect the persuasiveness of the case you make. Usually it's not good to be too brash, but you also don't want to be so pompous that you avoid the most cogent analysis." At this point, the student will probably say, "Yes, but can I do this?" Whereupon you should send out for pizza and repeat your advice as many times as necessary. End quote. So Abelson was writing about what sort of rhetorical style one should adopt while writing up the results section of a research report. If your style is too brash, he said, you may endorse exciting conclusions prematurely. And if your style is too stuffy, you may resist interesting conclusions that are correct or at least illuminating. Instead of these, he recommended that one adopt rhetorical styles that lie between these two extremes. Either the liberal posture, willing to entertain interesting possibilities that are suggested, if not really proven by the data, or the conservative pose, reluctant to go too far beyond the data, but without being priggish about it. Abelson's aim was a little narrower than mine is today. I am not so concerned about how one presents oneself to readers of academic articles, but rather with how one presents a statistical argument to people who are unlikely to read any academic article ever, but who may still be interested in what can be said of thought processes or social relations in light of psychological research. And so I say, interpreting a statistical result is in some ways not unlike interpreting an historical event. We have a body of incomplete information. Some of it suggests one interpretation, some of it suggests another, contrary interpretation. And we're trying to figure out how much weight to give each item of information to draw a reasonable and plausible conclusion. So, should we take the king at his word when he wrote that his only aim in ordering his army to attack its own citizens was to defend innocence from a mob of violent revolutionaries, such as this? Or was that just a bit of self-serving propaganda manufactured to displace blame from himself? What other evidence can we bring to bear on the question? Were any innocents actually attacked? Was the crowd truly threatening the Capitol or just protesting in front of government buildings? Did the army use the minimum force required to break it up? Or did they doggedly pursue and kill fleeing survivors? Did the king have a history of being open to petitioners or punitive toward them? Historians can never be certain. They can only try to balance the available evidence to draw the most plausible conclusion. A statistical argument is in many ways similar. We attempt to draw a likely conclusion from incomplete, inconclusive evidence. But that conclusion isn't given to us directly by the statistical tests we employ. Just like the historian, it is an interpretation that we assemble from the totality of our statistical results, among other things. For instance, this standard parametric test suggests a significant difference, but the distributional assumptions of that test are not well met by the data. Fortunately, there is a related non-parametric test, but it suggests non-significance here. However, its power is low, and so it may be missing the signal amidst the noise. More data might help to clarify things, but it is not readily available. And even if mere significance held up, would the size of the effect be large enough to be interesting? What if I used confidence intervals instead? These are, note, all ordinary English sentences. I am debating myself about what conclusion I am entitled to draw and what the implications of doing so might be. Yes, the English sentences of this internal debate involve the technical apparatus of statistical tests, but my goal in using those tests is to provide evidence, or not, for the plausibility of a linguistic conclusion. Now, let me say here, because I am bound to be misunderstood by some, that of course I believe that students need to know how to use formulas, how to enter data values into them, how to correctly compute the results, though computers do much, probably too much of that for them these days. They should probably also have some proficiency at algebraically manipulating formulas to provide the different solutions they might need. Too many students do not attain sufficient facility with the mathematical style of thinking. I agree with all of that, amen. But I also think that in our haste to hammer into their heads the correct degrees of freedom for the numerator in a test of simple main effects or whatever, that we have ignored something else that they need to be able to use, that they need to be able to use statistics fluently, flexibly, and even creatively. They need, ultimately, not to regard the formula as a black box into which numbers flow and out of which final results mysteriously emerge. They should be able to understand what they are doing and why they are doing it each step along the way, including the interpretive work that comes after the test. And ideally, they should be able to do it fluently enough that they can explain to someone who doesn't understand statistics, persuade them even, that undertaking this arcane process tells you something you actually want to know, something that you wouldn't know otherwise. That ability is humanistic. Indeed, it is the venerable art of rhetoric. In my ideal statistics course, students would be able to move seamlessly back and forth between mathematical and ordinary language descriptions of what they are doing. It is in that ability that they will find the mastery that so many pedagogical experts say we should be educing from our students, not just mere competence. And by the way, in the process of learning how to persuade others, they will also learn how to explain it to themselves, rather than just take the formulas as esoteric truths that have dropped from on high onto the pages of their vulgar textbooks below. What is more, it will help to prevent ridiculous statistical errors that we all see, negative variances, t-values in the hundreds, and so forth, because they will actually understand what they are doing, not just crank through it like a mechanical jack-in-the-box, waiting to be surprised and amused when the clown unexpectedly pops up. So that is all. But it comes from my own experience at one particular school with a particular population of students. York is a vast school, 60,000 students, and its student body tends to be highly diverse ethnically, and a lot of those students are first gen. Not everyone else's experience has been the same as mine. So while I'm happy to take questions and in response quickly cover over my mistakes with elaborate rhetorical flourishes, I would also like to invite people to recount their own experiences with different kinds of schools and different populations of students. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thanks, Chris. That was fantastic. I'm sure we have a lot of questions on a lot of